All right, welcome to the this installment of the High Ability Learners and Differentiation webinar series. I am Cheyenne Meadows. I'm the High Ability Learning Specialist at the Nebraska Department of Education. And today I have with me Beth Maloney from Omaha Public Schools. And we are going to be talking about supporting high ability learners through creativity. Hello. So I'm going to start by laying down some groundwork for creativity, and later on Beth is going to talk about some really great strategies to use in the classroom. So we want to make sure that we all have kind of the same definition and understanding of creativity. And so this was set forth by Torrance, who he created the Torrance test of creativity. And he defines creativity as a process of becoming sensitive to problems, deficiencies, and gaps in knowledge, identifying difficulties, searching for solutions, making guesses, formulating hypotheses, testing, retesting hypotheses, modifying, and finally communicating results. So he is taking an approach of creativity that maybe we're not totally familiar with. A lot of times when we think of creativity, we think more along the lines of performing arts or painting or drawing or those different kinds of things. But today when we talk about creativity, we're going to be talking about this idea of coming up with new novel ideas and projects and how those work to support high ability learners. Another definition of creativity, which I think is really great, from Joe Renzulli and Sally Reese, they break down this dichotomy of schoolhouse giftedness and creative productive giftedness. So when we look at the definition of schoolhouse giftedness, we see that more classic idea of what gifted students are. So the students that are great at test taking, they've got good grades, they're academically above their peers, they are generally scoring well on cognitive assessments and score well on more traditional assessments in school. But they step aside and they define another kind of giftedness that is called creative productive giftedness. And this focuses on those students who may not have those more traditional characteristics, or maybe they're not as good in the academic setting, but they are really great at producing information and producing new ideas and using problem-solving processes. And so these students are, rather than receiving knowledge and repeating it onto a test or using it in those kinds of ways, they take in that knowledge and they produce their own thoughts and ideas in materials. And so it's more of that inductive reasoning, and it's more problem-oriented when we think of creative productive giftedness. And that's where we get one of the more popular models for creativity is called the confidential model of creativity. And this was laid forth by Teresa Amabile, and she's actually a business professor at Harvard University. And she was creating, when she was creating this model, she did not necessarily have gifted or education in mind, but this spans across all fields. And what does it look like to be a creative individual in a field? And so it's grounded in that definition that creativity is new ideas that are appropriate and accomplish a goal. So if we're looking at the field of science, what is a new novel theory or idea, and what problem does it solve, what goal does it accomplish, etc. So she breaks it down into different domains here, and where it all comes together is where we see that middle shaded section, and that's where we really want to live, and that's where creative production happens. So this comes from the coalescence of domain relevant skills. So those are the things we think of that are just knowledge within a field, technical language of an expert, academic knowledge falls in here as well. And this is the foundation for ideas. So they have this body of knowledge, that domain knowledge, and this is where they're going to put their ideas up against and test their already existing knowledge. So we have their domain relevant skills, and then they move into the creative relevant processes. So we need them to have these intrapersonal and affective skills and personality characteristics, such as independence, risk-taking, able to see new perspectives, disciplined in their work style. And that goes along with task motivation. And when she was talking about task motivation in an article published in 2012, it really is talking solely about that intrinsic motivation and that passion that the student has for a project. And so people are more compelled to be creative when they're genuinely interested and get satisfaction from the work rather than an external reward. So if we have these three things all coming together, we also have to think about the environment. So the external stimuli, barriers such as restrictive workplaces, harsh criticisms, emphasis on placed on status quo, or we have environments that have great intrinsic motivators that stimulate creativity, such as more freedom in work, collaborative teaming, encouraging supervisors, promoting development of new ideas. So these components all come together, and this is where this theory meets and says creative production happens when we can allow the environment to be conducive to creativity, when we have somebody that is really strong in an area and they are intrinsically motivated and they are able to take on these different creative productive characteristics. That is where we find creativity happening, especially in the realm of talking about students who are gifted or even into gifted adulthood. So now that we have laid the groundwork for what creativity is, we have to understand what creativity is not in the classroom. So arts and crafts, when we think creative time, time for students to do fun things like that. But these are not necessarily creative on their own. Things like arts and crafts can be creative if directions call for it, but it is not substantial if they are not required to produce novel ideas. Wildly unrealistic ideas with no substance are also is also not creative. It's imaginative, and it means the student might have a great imagination, but if they come up with these kind of crazy off the wall ideas and they aren't able to ground it in a solution to a problem, that's not creativity, that's just imagination. The visual and performing arts are also not classified as creativity. On the scale of identification and through the National Association for Gifted Students, the visual performing arts can be a classification of gifted. So a child can be gifted in visual performing arts, but being able to perfectly play a piano piece at a young age is impressive, but it's not creative. So they can be gifted there, but it's not creative because they are reproducing something that's already been done. Now, if they're writing and playing their own music, that would be creative production. But being able to replicate a performance is a different kind of giftedness from creativity. Hands-on or close-ended projects. So just because a project is hands-on does not necessarily mean that it is creative. If it has a right answer, if all of the products are going to look very similar or the same, it is not necessarily a creative project. But also, we don't want to have projects without constraints, because if they don't have constraints, they are not forced into thinking about a problem and practical solutions. Actually, the research suggests that having constraints are better for creativity. Too much freedom with no rules can cause a loss of focus, and they might not find an applicable solution. So when they're constrained by rules or laws that govern a field, they're forced to think about how to solve problems in novel ways whilst being resourceful and staying kind of within the lines. That causes that creative thinking. But why does creativity matter? So if we know in schools we value academic success and academic giftedness, why does creative giftedness matter? So we know based on research that creative production is important, especially in adulthood and in many fields that our students are going to go into. So we see this in an article from Plucker. In longitudinal studies, some elementary school students were tested. They were using the Torrance model which is the Torrance test of creative thinking. And the students who scored higher on those were 3 times more likely to have production as an adult that ended in some kind of public recognition. So we know that children who have that propensity for creative thinking, we need to foster that, because as they go into adulthood, those are going to be the ones that are making new things in fields and changing things within fields. Additionally, we know that it's something that can be developed. So creative thinking skills, like in school, if we think about metaphorical thinking, divergent thinking, creative problem solving, we can systemically develop those in early, middle childhood and adolescence. And that is how we are going to help our students move through and into a more productive phase of life versus just regurgitating information. We want them to be able to be productive members of whatever field they choose to go into. While we can teach and foster creativity, there are some traits that come naturally to creative individuals. So, for example, creative individuals a lot of times have an independent attitude, and especially in social settings, they are more likely to take on those new or novel ideas that maybe other people are hesitant to. They a lot of times can be dominant for that same reason. And it's those kids who can really tolerate ambiguity. We all know those gifted kids who need hard and fast answers and everything is in black and white. Some of those kids can really tolerate some of that ambiguity and wrestle with questions that may not have a concrete answer. They also show a wide variety of interests usually, intuitiveness, very flexible. And another big one is being able to take risks, because we know that new or novel ideas may not always succeed. And so they have to be able to take those risks on something they know may not be correct. They a lot of times have great social presence and poise. We know that part of this is being able to communicate your results. And so those students who aren't able to communicate results, they're not going to have that creative production because they're not able to take that next step and move a field forward if they cannot present their results correctly. They oftentimes reject external constraints. Again, that idea of creating new and novel ideas is tempting to them. They fantasize and toy with ideas pretty often, and they have this commitment to work. We know that task commitment that is intrinsic is really important. So a lot of times these kids are motivated to work, and we see that coming from within. There are also different factors that contribute to creativity. So we have conditions for which creativity can happen, and then we have some personal characteristics. So if we give conditions and we want, and it's not just us, it's the environment, it's the thing around us. So we want to encourage novelty. And we want to make sure that students are creating things that are useful and appropriate to the subject matter. We want to consider the social context in which they're in. Articulation of products is really huge. We want to make sure that we are teaching students to prefer quality over quantity. So they may come up with a million ideas, but maybe only one of them is really great, and that's what we need to focus on. Timing is really big. As we know, in everything, it's all about timing. Having that background content knowledge is important. And most importantly of all, just having a time to practice, to make those mistakes, to get things wrong, to do it over and over again and go back and tweak those hypotheses until they're correct. And then some personal characteristics, kind of relating back to that last slide. They have to be open to new experience and risk-taking. A lot of times the students are non-conforming and independent, and they have that confidence in themselves. So those are more of the kind of theoretical underpinnings of what we're going to talk about. So now that we understand what creativity is, kind of what it looks like, I'm going to hand it over to Beth, who is going to talk about strategies.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Beth Maloney, and I work for OPS. I'm supervised, gifted, and talented. Some of you I know really well, and you know me, and some of you I've never met before. So thanks for having me today. I kind of felt like this opened up this rabbit hole that I just couldn't keep. I just kept digging and digging. There's so many ideas out there for creativity. And so this is just a smattering of ideas for you, but the list can go on. And I would love at the end to hear some of the ideas that you have about strategies for creativity. but I just wanted to add a couple things about students who think creativity or who think creatively. And I always like to I know, I'm sure you all do the same, picturing kids in your head of who really exhibits this so that and it helps kind of make a frame of mind for what we're looking for. But they express ideas that other students don't think of. They like to choose their own way of demonstrating understanding. Um, they ask questions that may seem off topic or silly, and they enjoy open-ended assignments and prefer to discuss ideas rather than facts, and prefer to try new ways of approaching a problem rather than the accepted ways. And I think as I was reading those, I was thinking a lot of this for a teacher of their mindset is how a student shows their learning and the discussion that happens throughout the course and of whatever the lesson might be. And so in our role working with teachers, it's trying to help them to recognize these things that we can do slightly differently to encourage the creativity in our kids. And I think that it would give them the opportunity to see their students in a completely different way. So those are just some things to look for. And something that Richard Cash wrote about was norms of a creative classroom. And I think we can all agree that not every classroom engages in these philosophies. I think everyone has good intentions, but really great teachers encourage curiosity and questions. Problems can be solved in many ways, and they are looking for students to be creative in how they solve their problems. That necessity is the mother of invention is just kind of interesting. Judgment and criticism are suspended. So that's really, I think, in how the students are interacting with each other. So they're encouraging and not tearing each other down. And the hardest of all is being patient and with your kids and allowing them to have that perseverance and persistence so that we're not giving them the answers and we're letting them really grapple with some ideas. So I have to say that I'm tooting the horn of OPS because a lot of these are things that we're doing right now all the time in some of these strategies. And some of them are things that I've done in the past and just ideas that we have. But like I said, this is not a final list of here's how to teach creativity, just some ideas. So we call this FFOE. It's written about in many places, but we're talking about fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. And so I'll talk about each of them individually. And really, for fluency, the action of coming up with many ideas is possible. Encouraging fluency can help students overcome their anxiety of having the one right answer. And we know that a lot of gifted kids have that trepidation of being wrong. And so if we can encourage them to think of lots of ideas and that there isn't one right answer, that they maybe some of that anxiety will be released. And so really these are kind of sentence starters or like question starters or just conversation starters. And there's many more in a list in Cash's book, which I'm just surrounded by a pile of books right now, but this is the one that I'm referencing a lot today. It's Advancing Differentiation. His blue book, the first one, it lists as many blank things as you can, or as many blue things as you can, or as many round things as you can, or whatever you're talking about at the time. List all the things that come in pairs, or list things that inspire, list the possible uses for a fork or whatever it might be, list ways to represent something, and list questions that you would ask. And you could use that in literacy, list questions that you would ask a certain character, list questions that you would ask in social studies about a topic or science, or questions that you have about a math problem. I mean, really the list goes on and on. I think sometimes it's tempting to try to teach creativity on its own, but what we need to be doing is teaching creativity integrated into everything that we do, especially in a classroom, but as GATE teachers, connecting it to some kind of content that they're learning about. The next is flexibility. And so flexibility is the ability to adapt to new situations and try various ways to approach and solve problems. It means not accepting the most obvious solution, and it teaches students to look at problems and ideas from many different angles. I think, sometimes they come up with an answer and they're like, well, I got one, so I'm done. And we know that that's something that we encourage a lot in a math classroom, is how can you come up with another way to solve that problem? But really, it applies everywhere. So just a few sentence starters for you. How many different ways can you categorize these items? Or how many different ways can you use a pencil? Or using metaphors, similes, and analogies? Or how else can you, whatever. Another way to look at it. So it's all about perspective. So this kind of, I think, ties in with when we were talking with Dr. Stambaugh about some of her work with perspectives and looking at things from multiple angles. And it's just trying to get kids to open their minds to different possibilities. So flexibility, it's super fun, I think, to talk about these things with kids. The development, so the next one is originality, and that would be the development of unique, unusual, and novel ideas. And I think that, we've heard kids say everything's already been thought of, or they might use someone else's idea, or they get stuck because they are afraid that they're not original enough. And I think that if you've ever played categories, that's kind of a fun thing to do for this thing, is come up with as many different things that start with the letter S, and then which one did you have that no one else had, about a topic, or creating a new use for something, designing a new ending, design a device to clean a messy room. This one is huge, that can be applied in so many ways, but I know if you've been working with GATE kids or HAL kids, that many kids get stuck on this idea of that everything's already been thought of. They're afraid to step out of their comfort zone and be new. So that is the O. The final of the FFOE is elaboration, the process of providing extensive and extended details. So we're expanding, embellishing, extending, refining, and stretching our ideas. And I think that the root is creative thinkers never stop trying to make their ideas better. And super fun thing that we used to do, and we do in our department, some people, is Shark Tank. It's really fun to watch the kids come up with ideas for that. And they're always refining and trying to make it a little bit better. But, just as simple as, how can you make a pencil more effective or interesting? Elaborating on a shape, technical manuals for peanut butter and jelly, or whatever it might be. So those are kind of foundational, the FFOE concepts of creativity. And we have a lot of units for that, but a specific strategy that I'm sure most of you have seen in action, one of the classics of gifted education, is the good old scamper. So we're substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, and reverse. You can apply this to so many ideas. A lot of our teachers scamper an Oreo, and they try to get the kids to come up with something new based on that. I've scampered ideas of businesses. In one of the books that I have, it talks about McDonald's, and actually applies kind of scamper to them and how they evolved their business. So I use this with my entrepreneurship kids in middle school to help them as a starting point for coming up with an idea for a business. But so it's great for second graders, and it's great for high school kids. It's just how you apply it and what you're teaching about. Highly recommend. There's tons and tons of resources out there about scamper. This one is a creative problem solving, is this document that I was too big to put in the slide. So I'll just show you the whole document. And it's really based on some of Sandra Kaplan's work with disciplinarians. But this is something that takes a while. And I watched my middle school kids struggle with this a lot because they wanted to rush through the process of creative problem solving. But it starts with choosing a problem. And as you work through, the kids looking at the perspective of whatever the disciplinarian is, and you can simplify it. You don't have to get into all those weeds. But brainstorming a list of problems that have to do with an idea. And one of the things about this is going back to what Cheyenne was saying, is that you're supposed to have 20 problems. So if you keep scrolling, you can see there's 20 spaces, and the kids need to fill up every space. And they struggle with that. What I notice about gate kids so often is that they want to be done. They don't want to stretch themselves. They're used to being able to say, I'm the first one done. I got it all ready. And so I don't want to finish. I already have a good idea. But once you can get them to push past that point and finish, and 20 is hard to get to, but if they're really working towards that challenge, then they'll do that. So that's the problems. So then they have to try to come up with the most significant problem that they have. And you might break this up so that they can't see the rest of the steps. So they don't want to skip to that one problem that they think is the best that they put on line number 2, and then moving on, then you start to brainstorm. Now you have to brainstorm your solutions to the problem. And again, they have to come up with 20 solutions to this problem. And as we know, they will struggle with that because they really don't want to think that hard. And maybe not. Maybe some of your kids will be just amazing the first time out, but I would suggest to you that you'll get some pushback. So then we talk about trying to narrow it down to the 10 most promising, creating some criteria. So they're kind of building a rubric for how they're going to evaluate their solutions, and which is really interesting. So they come up with their solutions, and then they have to put their criteria across the top there. And then they have to evaluate their solutions until they get to their last solution, and then they can write about that. And working through that process takes a while, but it's worth it to really push them and just give them that think time and to come up with, it's amazing what they'll come up with. So I think we linked that in the chat, so you have that document. I think it's great. And the next thing that I have for you is another book. I like books a lot. And this one is the Sparking Student Creativity. I bought this, well, actually a small group has this right now, but it has some really great grab and go ideas for it. She gets into some research about creativity, but I'll just give you a couple samples of her grab and go ideas. So one of them is called 3 Wishes. So you could use this like in a literature unit where a student would say what would be the 3 wishes that this character might grant or that they might ask for, or you could apply that in a lot of different situations. There's another one called 10 Statements, and it's kind of along the lines of that category. So putting up an object or quote, and then the students would have to write statements that go along with it, but you're trying to create a statement that you think that no one else would think of. There's one about avatars and creating your own avatar and putting it into like a world, or maybe you could put it into a book that you're reading or something like that. But there are like 100 grab and go ideas in this book that are all just kind of quick, easy things to do, ideas for creativity. I've been fascinated with it. I haven't gotten to dive into it as much yet as I would like to, but very timely because we just bought that. Another book that is really actually a business. It's written originally for people who work with businesses or like business people who create products and things like that. But they have all these different creative thinking techniques. Scamper is in there actually. But there's things like Think Bubbles is one. There's an idea grid, Lotus Blossom, Phoenix, and these ones have a lot of detail in how they describe their creative thinking ideas. The Da Vinci Technique is another one with drawing and writing questions. And I didn't make a slide for it, but this is another book that I put in the reference section of how to think like Leonardo da Vinci. I actually learned about this at NAG 100 years ago, and I'm passing it on again to anyone who wasn't there with me 100 years ago. But this Da Vinci's kind of philosophy of life was just asking a lot of questions and being very thoughtful about his environment. And he did a lot of drawing. And I always make my kids draw a lot because it doesn't matter about how well you draw. It's really about the thinking and just putting your ideas on paper. So I think some of these in this book can be a little bit high level. So this would be a really good book if you're working with older kids. You can definitely modify them down. But that one's full of different ideas. Let's see. Oh, problem-based learning. Yeah, we are using problem-based learning as the foundation for a class that we have for our middle schools called Honor Special Projects. All of our teachers that teach that class are in the process of being trained by an institution called the Buck Institute. And I've linked the pblworks.org at the bottom. That's where you can learn about all the different trainings. But essentially problem-based learning, which I'm sure that you have heard of before, is allowing the students to work on a problem of their own design. So they get to decide as a team what they want to work on, and over an extended period of time, engage in solving that real world problem. And so one of my middle schools right now are working on evaluating the books in their library, and they're documenting all of the literature that they find in the library, and then they're going to be creating a list of recommendations to determine whether the books in the library match the clientele of their school, and if there's gaps, then they're going to try to make recommendations. And that's something that they've been working on for at least a quarter. So I highly recommend the Buck Institute if you're wanting really great professional development. It's 3 days for PBL 101, and right now it's online. So if you want to do it, or if you want to send someone to it, that's what we're doing from middle school for GATE across the board. And what I like about it is that it's personalized for the kids, so, or what their interest is, so they can decide what they want to study. And so this is just a sample of a rubric that was designed by the Buck Institute to kind of evaluate the projects. And so we're looking at what the goals are, what's the project design, what is the question, and they do a good job of teaching you how to write great questions so that it is something meaty that the kids can really sink their teeth into for an extended period of time. They call them gold standard problem-based learnings, and they have a whole library of them too that you can look through, so you don't have to come up with everything on your own. You can always see what they've already created. A big piece of that is the sustained inquiry, and making sure it's something we can focus on for a long time. It wouldn't necessarily be a really great PBL if it was something that could be done in a day or even a week. Is it authentic? So is it something that the kids that are working on it, or the people, could be adults, see as something that really matters to them? Is the student voice and choice a part of the project? Are they able to reflect? The reflection is a big part of problem-based learning, and the students are allowed a chance to critique their work and as a group what they've done, and to say, if we were going to do this again, what would it look like? And then the culmination is a public product, so it's something that they can present to a real audience. And having that, knowing up front that that's coming, is a big motivator for the kids. The particular group I'm talking about will present to the principal, to the media specialist at their school, so they know that they can't cut corners. If they're going to be able to have that audience, then they need to really put up a good product. So I can't say enough good things about PBL. So, but I will move on now. Another thing that we implemented this year in our elementary classrooms is the Genius Hour, which isn't new information for most of you have heard of Genius Hour. We purchased both of these books for all of our elementary GATE staff. So the first is more of the theory, the black one on the top. And it tells you about how Genius Hour should be run and why. It allows kids to follow a passion that they have and be creative in how they want to go about creating a project. But you set the parameters, and the ready to use resources in the white book on the bottom does a nice job of giving you templates and resources to guide the students' thinking. It's not a free for all. It is not, there's no end, there's no guidance along the way. This is Andy McNair's work, but she does a really good job of setting up the students for success. I've been part of projects with kids where they didn't have as much guidance and it felt unattainable to the kids because they just didn't know what the end was. It was really, and then they lose interest because they can't imagine what it's going to be at the end. And so that goes back to what Cheyenne was talking about at the beginning of the presentation about, it can't be open-ended to the point of having zero parameters, because that's too much for anyone. It's too much for me. I need a deadline. Otherwise I get nothing done. I just sit and think. And then an oldie but a goodie is Bertie King-Orr. She was the first person I ever saw present about gifted and talented when I was in the classroom. And I walked away from one day with her and changed so many things about how I teach. One of my favorites is the third one. Question that is a bulletin board where, as the teacher, I had a spot for each student. And every week I would put up an answer. So it could be the number 6. It could be the Civil War or something, depending on what we were learning about. And the kids had that week to write a really great question where that was the answer to their question. And it was just fun. Not every kid did it every time, but it gave them, and they could change it. If they came up with a new one, then they could put a new one up on the board. And it was just really fun to watch the kids be creative in how they wrote a question, but it flipped it on them because they're so used to answering questions all the time. Draw starts is another one I used extensively, where she has some that are pre-made in her book, where it's kind of like a little triangle or a squiggle mark or whatever. You can make your own draw starts, but then the job is to turn that into a picture of something, and you try to guide them to what the topic is. So sometimes I use draw starts when I was doing novel studies. Like, do you need to draw a scene and use these as the beginning of your scene, from the story that you're reading? The perspective map. So there's a square in the middle, and then on the outside are 3 kind of thought bubbles. And so in the middle is a picture of an object of something that you're studying. And then the perspectives are 4 different perspectives of the student's choice about how they would interact with that center object, or how they feel about it, or like the example she has is a bald eagle, and then one of the perspectives is a rabbit, and how does a rabbit feel about a bald eagle compared to a child feel about a bald eagle, or the environmental protection agency feels about the bald eagle. So anyway, it's really great. It applies to so many things that it's brilliant. Why didn't I think of this? I need to start writing books. Anyway, so that's Bertie. I put in the resources at the end. I just put some citations for all the books that I referenced. So you have those, but I'd be curious if any of you guys have other ideas that I didn't talk about, because I really felt like I could just talk and talk. So I won't. You could chat. We could open up the chat too if you're wanting to share an idea that you have about that you feel like is great for creativity.
I know that a lot of these strategies that you gave, Beth, link back to a lot of those creative thinking models, like a lot of the King-Orr ones link to the Torrance test of creativity and the project-based learning. We know is like good for all students, but there are ways to scaffold it for gifted learning. And so all these strategies are really malleable and really great.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about developing talent. And so, you know, we've been discussing putting or pushing into our primary classrooms. And I think that kind of opening the eyes of the classroom teacher a little bit by doing some of these things, they'll just see their kids in a different way. And it might encourage them to do have some new ideas. The king or that I have right now, Beth, is from, I think, 2001. So it's old, but I don't think I could, or I think I cited a newer one, but this is the, well, this is the second edition, I guess. You're right. I just love it. Birdie's just, she's awesome. I get really excited when I talk, so I'm sorry to be a little bit crazy there, but.
No, I love it. I love the enthusiasm. We all appreciate it so much. And I'm sure that as people email me for the slides, if you're watching the recording, make sure to email me for the slides and I will send those out. Other than that, Beth and I will be on for a few moments if you guys want to ask any questions or anything else. But thank you guys so much for attending and for watching. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you, guys.